The shadow rises. In the underworld, legends aren't born loud, they appear quietly when no one's paying attention. That's how Marty Robert entered the story. To most Canadians in the 1990s, the name meant nothing. But to those in Quebec's biker scene, it was whispered like a prophecy. A young man with the discipline of a soldier and the instincts of a survivor. He wasn't the kind of outlaw who lived for chaos. He lived for the order hiding underneath it. Back then, Quebec wasn't just another province, it was a battlefield. The Quebec Biker War had already begun to carve scars into Montreal. The Hells Angels, led by the infamous Maurice "Mom" Boucher, were fighting a brutal war for control of Quebec's drug and enforcement markets. Their enemies, the rock machine, refused to submit. It wasn't a rivalry, it was an open conflict. Bombs in cars, shootings in parking lots, informants vanishing before trials. Between 1994 and 2002, more than 160 people died. Civilians, club members, police officers, and family members caught in the crossfire. That's the world Marty grew up in. To survive it, you couldn't just be tough, you had to be strategic. Marty was both. He started small, working as a courier for local crews, tied loosely to the Angels' orbit. What separated him from most young bikers wasn't muscle or ego, it was patience. He didn't talk much, didn't show off, and never drew unnecessary heat. When police raided a stash house he had been frequenting, they found everyone but him. He'd left the day before. Not because someone tipped him off, but because he sensed something was off. That instinct saved him more than once. In those years, Boucher's empire ruled Montreal like an army. He controlled the city's drug trade, infiltrated unions, and turned biker clubs into militarized branches of a criminal corporation. But as the war dragged on, the walls began to close in. Police formed Operation Springtime 2001, a coordinated crackdown that saw hundreds arrested, including Boucher himself. The Hells Angels' throne was empty, and every ambitious man in Quebec's underworld wanted it. Marty didn't step forward. He stepped back. While others tried to claim power too quickly, Marty disappeared for a while, moving through Quebec, Ontario, even across the border. Rumors said he was laying low in Mexico, building relationships with middlemen connected to both the Italian mob and Latin American cartels. Others said he was quietly keeping Boucher's contacts alive, maintaining the channels that made the Angels network profitable even after their leader was locked away. Whatever the truth was, one fact stood. When Marty returned to Quebec in the mid-2000s, he wasn't the same young courier anymore. He came back with knowledge, and with connections that stretched far beyond Canada. He understood that the old version of the Hells Angels, the one built on raw violence, was dead. The police had learned how to fight that kind of power. What they couldn't fight was subtlety, organization, business. Marty began reorganizing the Montreal chapters from the inside out. He convinced older members that survival depended on modernization. Fewer explosions, more infiltration, no more turf wars in broad daylight, only partnerships, mergers, and quiet takeovers. It was the kind of thinking that turned an outlaw club into a criminal corporation. He modeled his playbook after men like Boucher, but stripped away the noise. Where Boucher had been charismatic and brutal, Marty was quiet and calculating. He didn't need to inspire fear. He inspired efficiency. Within a few years, he had built alliances with some of the most dangerous organizations on the continent, the Rizzuto crime family in Montreal, Ndrangheta cells in Ontario, and Mexican suppliers moving product through the eastern seaboard. By the late 2000s, investigators started noticing a pattern. Drug shipments were still moving, money was still flowing, but the violence that used to accompany those trades had almost vanished. It wasn't peace, it was management. When law enforcement finally caught on, they realized something alarming. The Hells Angels weren't weakening after Boucher's downfall. They were evolving. And behind that evolution was a man who never spoke to reporters, never appeared in photographs, and rarely even showed his face at public runs. Marty had become the new architect of Quebec's underworld, a man who could sit at a table with killers and businessmen and speak the same language. He didn't just rebuild the organization. He rebranded it. Members who used to wear their colors proudly now dressed like entrepreneurs. Harleys were parked beside black SUVs. Meetings were held in restaurants instead of clubhouses. Every detail, from the way they moved money to the way they communicated, changed. The biker world had entered the digital age, and Marty was the one who led it there. By the time police started piecing together his network, it wasn't just local anymore. There were confirmed Angel ties in Toronto, Vancouver, Sweden, Norway, and Australia, all coordinated quietly, without fanfare. And in every operation, there was a whisper that led back to him. Reporters started calling him the accountant of the Angels. Inside the underworld, they had a different name, the Shadow, because that's how he worked, unseen, unhurried, and always 2 steps ahead. He didn't chase power. He let it accumulate. He didn't start wars. He let others exhaust themselves fighting before stepping in to negotiate the peace. To him, chaos wasn't an obstacle. It was a market opportunity. By the early 2000s, Marty had turned his club into something that looked less like a gang and more like a networked syndicate, one that blended the traditions of the outlaw world with the efficiency of organized crime. He built relationships with politicians, businessmen, and legitimate companies, using clean money to wash the dirty. Every deal had layers, every layer had protection, and yet he never forgot where he came from. He still rode occasionally, still kept his leather, still spoke the language of the road, because for all his structure and sophistication, Marty Robert understood the one truth every outlaw learned sooner or later: the system only works if the brotherhood believes in it. He gave them something to believe in again, not rebellion, not revenge, but endurance. And in doing that, he didn't just rebuild a club, he built an empire. The Quebec Biker War. Before Marty Robert became the silent architect of Canada's underworld, he had to survive the storm that made it. The Quebec Biker War wasn't just a conflict, it was an era. Between 1994 and 2002, it transformed Montreal from a city of culture into a war zone, and the streets became a graveyard for anyone wearing a patch. For Marty, it was the crucible that taught him everything he would later use to build his empire: patience, strategy, and the understanding that chaos can be profitable if you know how to read it. It started with Maurice "Mom" Boucher, the man who once ruled the Hells Angels nomad chapter like a general commanding an army. Boucher wanted total control of Quebec's lucrative drug trade, and standing in his way was the Rock Machine, a smaller but stubborn club with strong local ties and no interest in bowing to anyone. The two groups collided in an explosion of arrogance and ambition that would last nearly a decade. Bombs were planted under cars, bullets were fired at cafes, and night after night, Montreal's news stations led with stories of shootings that seemed to have no end. The war wasn't just between bikers anymore. Civilians, girlfriends, and even journalists started dying. The violence spilled into neighborhoods that had nothing to do with motorcycles. Every killing invited retaliation, and every retaliation was another message sent in blood. Marty wasn't one of the headline names back then, but he was there, watching it unfold. He was part of the new generation, young, fast, and ambitious, but smart enough to know that survival meant staying 2 steps behind the spotlight. When police raids scattered crews across the province, he learned to move quietly, never staying in one place too long. When older members got caught in wiretaps or taken down by undercover stings, he studied how they slipped, how pride made them careless, how loyalty without discretion became a death sentence. Every mistake he saw was a lesson. Every funeral was a reminder. By the late 90s, the body count had become impossible to ignore. Over 160 people had been killed. The public wanted answers, and the government wanted results. That's when Operation Springtime 2001 began, a massive coordinated strike involving hundreds of officers targeting the Hells Angels and their support clubs. For years, law enforcement had struggled to pin the Angels down, but Boucher's arrogance had finally given them a target. His conviction for ordering the murder of 2 prison guards didn't just remove the head of the organization. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had protected them. Within months, the nomads were either dead, in prison, or on the run. The Angels' empire was burning. That was when Marty made his move, not to seize power, but to survive the collapse. While the media celebrated Boucher's downfall as the end of the Angels in Quebec, Marty knew better. He knew the network itself, the pipelines, the suppliers, the informants, the fronts, was still there, even if the leadership wasn't. He quietly started contacting the few remaining nomad loyalists who hadn't been arrested. He offered them stability, not revenge. Instead of rebuilding the same violent empire that had drawn so much attention, he began laying the groundwork for something different. He met with middlemen who had once been suppliers to both sides of the war. He opened communication with minor clubs that had been neutral during the conflict, independent writers who were tired of living between bullets. Slowly, he began to rebuild connections that had been severed by fear and mistrust. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was the one who got things done. Word started spreading quietly. Marty could be trusted. At the same time, he kept an eye on the Rizzuto crime family, who were weathering their own internal storm. The Rizzutos had been the silent power behind much of Quebec's organized crime since the 1980s, and Marty recognized their method: control through consistency, not chaos. The Biker War had shown him that guns win battles, but structure wins wars, and he started to model his future on that philosophy. When the dust settled, the landscape had changed. The rock machine had splintered. Some members patched over to the Angels, others disappeared. The Angels, though weakened, were still standing. But this time, they needed new leadership, not another warlord, but a strategist, someone who could unify without drawing heat. In the vacuum that followed, Marty began to emerge as exactly that. He didn't declare himself a leader. He simply became indispensable. He coordinated between isolated chapters, fixed disputes, and handled negotiations with suppliers. Every time someone needed a solution that didn't involve bloodshed, they called him. By the mid-2000s, he had become the quiet diplomat of the Angels' fractured empire, the man who could walk into a meeting of rival gangs and walk out with peace instead of casualties. During these years, Marty spent time outside Canada, traveling through Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America. Officials later claimed he was developing contacts with drug suppliers, but those who knew him said he was doing something far more important, learning how international networks actually worked. He returned to Canada not just as a biker, but as a businessman. The war had taught him what not to do. Now, he was ready to build something that couldn't be destroyed by headlines or police raids. By the time Quebec started to rebuild from the violence, Marty was already shaping the next phase. He worked to restore old alliances, bringing back order to a scene that had been defined by death for nearly a decade. The media might not have known his name yet, but in the streets, in the bars, and in the dimly lit garages where business was done, everyone knew who was quietly pulling things back together. He once told an associate, "Violence ends when the money's good enough." It wasn't a justification. It was a statement of principle. Marty understood that if you wanted to rule the underworld, you couldn't do it through fear forever. Fear makes men unpredictable. Money makes them loyal. By the late 2000s, Quebec's biker scene had changed completely. The police thought they'd won. The public thought it was over. But behind the curtain, a new order was forming. One built not on chaos, but on precision. Not on ego, but on systems. And the man designing those systems was the quiet survivor of the war. Everyone thought it ended. Marty Robert, the man who had watched the storm, learned from it, and was now preparing to rebuild the empire that had nearly destroyed itself. He had survived the bloodiest chapter in Canadian organized crime history, not by being the strongest, but by being the smartest. The Biker War had forged him in fire. What came next would show what that fire had created. The Capo of Montreal. By the time the smoke cleared from the Quebec Biker War, the criminal landscape of Montreal looked nothing like the one Marty Robert had grown up in. The bloodshed had ended, but the silence that followed was deceptive. The power vacuum left behind by Boucher's fall wasn't empty for long. It was filled by smaller, hungrier men, each one trying to claim a piece of what used to be an empire. Marty watched it all from the background, patient as ever, waiting for the noise to eat itself alive. He understood something most people didn't. Real power doesn't come from what you control, it comes from what you can stabilize. The biker war had proven that chaos didn't make men strong. It just made them visible, and visibility, in their world, was a death sentence. Marty's next move wasn't about guns or drugs. It was about structure. He wasn't rebuilding a gang. He was rebuilding an institution. The first step was consolidating Montreal. For decades, the city had been carved into invisible borders, corners run by bikers, blocks overseen by mob associates, and docks quietly managed by longshore unions that answered to no one. It was a city of competing fiefdoms, and no one had ever successfully unified them. Marty intended to be the first. He started by reaching out to the men who had been sidelined by the war, the ones who had lost brothers, turf, or faith. He didn't promise revenge. He promised order. He spoke to them like a businessman, not a soldier, laying out a new model, less blood, more business. For many, that was exactly what they wanted to hear. The old days of public shootouts and car bombs were over. The new era, Marty said, was about influence, quiet, calculated, and sustainable. He understood that violence draws cameras, but cooperation draws cash. The men who joined him early on weren't the loud ones. They were the ones who understood numbers, supply chains, and logistics. Together, they turned what was left of the Hells Angels in Quebec into something resembling a corporate syndicate. To outsiders, the transformation was invisible. But inside the world of organized crime, people noticed the difference. The new Hells Angels meetings looked less like biker rallies and more like board meetings. Financial ledgers replaced coded notebooks. They stopped using burners for every transaction and started routing communication through legitimate businesses, trucking companies, recycling centers, security firms. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it was the same engine, just wearing a suit. Law enforcement began referring to Marty as the Capo of Montreal. The nickname stuck, not because it was flashy, but because it fit. He didn't command through fear. He commanded through efficiency. He didn't micromanage. He delegated. His people weren't just bikers anymore. They were administrators, accountants, logistics specialists. Under Marty, every chapter had quotas and budgets. Every operation had oversight. Every dollar was tracked. The chaos that had destroyed the last generation was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: competence. His relationship with the real crime family became central to this rise. While Boucher had tried to dominate the Sicilians through aggression, Marty approached them through partnership. He recognized that Montreal wasn't big enough for another full-scale war. The Rizzutos had global reach, political influence, and old-world discipline. Exactly the kind of power structure he respected. Rather than competing for territory, Marty offered them collaboration. The Rizzutos would continue to manage high-level importation, while the Angels would handle distribution and enforcement. It was a merger, not a feud. That alliance brought stability, but it also brought profit. The cocaine routes from South America, once volatile and fragmented, became streamlined under shared management. Marty's crews coordinated with Sicilian intermediaries to reduce overlap and eliminate competition. For the first time in decades, Montreal's underworld was unified under a loose but functional hierarchy. The mafia at the top, the Angels as the enforcement and logistics arm, and smaller independent crews feeding off the structure below. It wasn't peace in the moral sense, but it was order. Marty's leadership style was the opposite of the men who came before him. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply spoke softly and expected to be obeyed. If someone broke protocol, they didn't get shot in the street, they were cut out of the system, which in Marty's world was a slower and far more painful death, because outside his structure, money dried up, contacts vanished, and protection disappeared. Everyone knew it was better to stay inside the machine than to be left standing in the cold. By 2010, Marty's influence had reached beyond Montreal. Ontario's biker scene, once controlled by competing clubs like the Outlaws and Vagabonds, was slowly shifting under his influence. Some chapters patched over, others simply agreed to cooperate under his terms. His reach extended west toward Manitoba and British Columbia, where Hells Angels already dominated. But now those chapters operated with Quebec's precision. Even across the border, in the northeastern U.S., detectives began noticing that the Canadians were running tighter than ever before. He never bragged about his position, but people inside the network started calling him the new Mom, a reference to Boucher's old title. Marty rejected it immediately. Mom was a warlord, he said once, according to an insider. I'm a builder. It wasn't arrogance, it was distinction. He had no interest in being remembered as another trigger-happy tyrant. He wanted to be remembered as the man who made chaos profitable and permanent. In time, his alliances grew beyond bikers and mobsters. He built relationships with corrupt officials, contractors, and businessmen who benefited from his quiet influence. Real estate developments, construction projects, and even nightlife venues started running through intermediaries tied to his network. The lines between crime and commerce blurred. When journalists tried to follow the money, they often hit dead ends, offshore accounts, shell companies, numbered corporations. Marty had learned from the best. He knew that in the 21st century, bullets were crude, paperwork was power. But not everyone approved of his modernization. Some old-school bikers resented the corporate tone of his leadership. They missed the days of open rebellion, the sense of outlaw identity that came with riding fast and living louder. Marty didn't stop them from riding. He just reminded them that brotherhood without discipline is chaos, and chaos is bad for business. Most of them listened. The ones who didn't quietly faded out, not killed, just irrelevant. By the mid-2000s, Marty's influence over Montreal was undeniable. He had unified the fractured biker scene, stabilized relations with the mafia, and expanded his operations internationally. His power wasn't loud, but it was absolute. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped. When he gave an order, people didn't argue. They just adjusted. And yet, he never seemed to crave the spotlight. While other leaders posed for photos or flaunted wealth, Marty remained the quiet one, the man behind the curtain who preferred efficiency over ego. Reporters would later call him the man who professionalized the Hells Angels. Inside the organization, they called him something simpler, the Capo, not because he ruled like a mob boss, but because he redefined what rule meant. He didn't see himself as an outlaw. He saw himself as a CEO, one running a multinational enterprise disguised as a motorcycle club. And in that role, Marty didn't just rebuild what was lost after the war. He built something new, something bigger, something built to last. The streets of Montreal were finally quiet again, not because the violence had ended, but because Marty had made sure no one dared disturb the order he created. The Empire of '81. By the mid-2000s, the Hells Angels were no longer just a club, a gang, or even an organization. They were an institution, and the architect behind that transformation was Marty Robert. His reach extended from the streets of Montreal to boardrooms in Ontario, from biker bars in Winnipeg to shipping ports in Scandinavia. He had built a network so disciplined, so interwoven, that it stopped being a regional empire and started looking like a global one. The outlaw world had never seen anything like it. The backbone of that expansion was Marty's alliance with Walter Stagnick, a veteran from Ontario who'd earned his reputation running logistics for the Angels' Western chapters. Where Marty brought structure, Walter brought scale. Together, they fused their regions into what insiders would later call the Canadian Combine, a single, unified command that controlled supply chains, enforcement, and finances from coast to coast. It wasn't just a criminal partnership, it was a merger. Their friendship was built on mutual respect. Walter was old school, gruff, pragmatic, but loyal. Marty was strategic, methodical, and quietly charismatic. He didn't talk about brotherhood the way other presidents did. He demonstrated it through consistency. Walter once said that Marty didn't lead by yelling. He led by never being wrong. The two men understood that if they could keep the Angels disciplined at home, they could expand anywhere. Together, they reshaped the '81 nation, the global identity of the Hells Angels, whose name came from the numeric code of their initials. The brand had power, 8 for H, 1 for A. Marty realized that those two numbers were more than a symbol. They were a trademark, an identity with international value. He treated the Hells Angels like a corporation with licensing rights. Every chapter, from Quebec to Queensland, operated under the same code of conduct and financial standards. Membership fees became investments. Local profits fed into regional coffers. Information flowed up. Orders flowed down. It was business with a criminal accent. When journalists later tried to map the flow of money, they hit walls everywhere. The Angels' revenue moved through offshore entities, European holding firms, and fake consulting companies that looked legitimate on paper. Marty's people even used blockchain wallets, long before the term became mainstream. Law enforcement agencies from multiple countries, RCMP, Interpol, Europol, started referring to the Canadian chapters as the model franchise. And Marty wasn't content with territory alone. He wanted influence. Under his leadership, the Angels expanded into industries that blurred the line between legal and illegal: construction, waste management, trucking, and private security. Each front served two purposes: laundering money and collecting information. Contracts won through intimidation became legitimate businesses over time. In some regions, the club had government licenses for the very industries they were using to hide profits. Walter Stagnick handled much of the West, tightening the Angels' grip on the transportation corridors running from Vancouver to the American border. Marty focused on the East: Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, where ports and warehouses were the lifeblood of importation. Together, they created a bi-coastal system that mirrored legitimate trade networks. Drugs, weapons, and money moved along the same highways as food and electronics. To law enforcement, it looked like commerce. To Marty, it was infrastructure. He called it the Red Line. Every Angel, no matter where they were, understood what that meant. The Red Line wasn't just a symbol, it was a network. It connected the chapters through shared routes, contacts, and internal communication channels that no police task force ever fully decoded. Even when one node was compromised, the rest adapted, rerouting traffic like a digital system. Marty had turned a gang into a living organism. To outsiders, it looked like peace. There were no public wars, no car bombs, no reckless displays of violence. But beneath that calm, a quiet revolution was taking place. The Angels were professionalizing faster than any criminal organization in North America. When rival clubs tried to challenge them, especially the Outlaws and Bandidos, Marty refused to take the bait. Instead of street retaliation, he used economics. He undercut competitors in distribution, bought their routes, or offered their members better pay. When money didn't work, diplomacy did. It was chess, not checkers, and Marty rarely lost a game. Internationally, he cultivated alliances with European chapters that had been struggling after years of police crackdowns. In Scandinavia, where biker wars once turned city streets into battlefields, Marty's structure brought stability. He offered advice, financing, and a model to replicate. Soon his influence stretched across the Atlantic. Meetings, once handled through chaotic phone calls, were now conducted through encrypted communication systems that he'd helped implement. The Angels in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden began mirroring the Canadian model: less flash, more function. His biggest achievement came when he helped broker a truce between feuding chapters in Australia and New Zealand. The media barely noticed, but within the outlaw community, it was legendary. He'd managed to do what decades of violence couldn't: create a network of Angels that cooperated instead of competed. In exchange, Canada gained access to international trade routes for both legitimate and illicit goods. Law enforcement called it a criminal renaissance. To Marty, it was just good management. The RCMP's 2017 National Threat Assessment described the Hells Angels under his tenure as a multinational organized crime network with centralized leadership and shared logistical systems. In less bureaucratic terms, that meant Marty Robert had turned Canada's outlaw culture into a shadow economy. His power wasn't visible, but it was absolute. He had lieutenants, regional captains, and accountants, each one loyal, each one replaceable. The days of impulsive violence were gone. Now punishment came quietly. A man would lose his business, his contacts, or his status, and then he'd disappear from relevance. There was no drama, no spectacle, just the cold efficiency of a man who believed that fear was less useful than control. Under Marty and Walter, the red and white patch, the death head, became one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. You could find it on vests in Toronto, on docks in Sydney, on leather jackets in Amsterdam. It meant the same thing everywhere: discipline, loyalty, and a direct line to the network's heart in Canada. And at the center of that heart sat Marty, still unseen, still understated, still quietly building. He rarely gave interviews, never made public appearances, and never allowed photographs. When Interpol released a brief on global organized crime, they referred to him not by name, but by code, Target 81. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. In private, Marty wasn't shy about what he'd built. "We're not the Hells Angels anymore," he once said to a trusted associate. "We're the infrastructure under everything." It wasn't bragging. It was a statement of fact. He had achieved something that even Boucher never managed: global respect. Rivals wanted to destroy him. Governments wanted to catch him. His own men wanted to emulate him. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Marty Robert did what no outlaw before him had done. He made the Underworld run on schedule. The outlaw world had evolved into an empire, and the empire had a name: 81 Nation, and its CEO was a man no one ever saw coming. Blood and diplomacy. By the time the 81 Nation was running like a well-oiled machine, Marty Robert had achieved what most in the underworld considered impossible: stability. The chaos that had once defined the Hells Angels was gone, replaced by structure and routine. But in the world Marty lived in, peace never came without a price. As his control expanded, so did the complexity of what surrounded him. The old boundaries between biker, mobster, and businessman were beginning to blur, and the next phase of his empire wasn't about violence. It was about diplomacy. The Rizzuto family, long considered the royal bloodline of Montreal's organized crime, had been weakened. Years of internal conflict and assassinations had left them fragmented. Their patriarch, Vito Rizzuto, had died in 2013, leaving behind a power vacuum that invited chaos. Rival factions circled like vultures. Street soldiers switched allegiances. For a while, Montreal teetered on the edge of another war, not between bikers and bikers this time, but between the remnants of the Sicilian mafia and a rising new order that had learned to operate in shadows instead of headlines. And at the center of that rising order was Marty. While the media speculated about which mob boss would take over, Marty was already moving behind the scenes. He reached out to Leonardo Rizzuto, Vito's son, a man raised in the old world of loyalty and honor, but forced to adapt to the new realities of survival. Leo wasn't a field general like his father. He was more like Marty, calm, rational, and capable of seeing 10 moves ahead. The two men spoke the same language, not of violence, but of control. Their first meeting, according to those close to both camps, was cautious but respectful. Leo had inherited the weight of a dynasty. Marty had built one from scratch. They both understood that another public war would destroy what was left of Montreal's underground economy. The police were stronger, the surveillance tighter, and the public less tolerant than ever. The only way forward was unity, a quiet, strategic truce. That truce became what insiders later called the Union. It wasn't a written agreement, not something that could ever be signed or documented. It was a handshake deal between two men who understood the value of restraint. The Union functioned as a joint network between the Hells Angels and the Rizzuto family, blending their strengths. The Angels controlled movement and distribution, while the Mafia handled importation, money laundering, and political influence. For the first time in decades, Montreal's two most powerful underworld forces operated under a shared umbrella. The Angels' muscle enforced the peace. The Mafia's structure financed it. And at the top of that arrangement, quietly mediating disputes and enforcing balance, was Marty Robert, the man who'd started as a courier and become a kingmaker. Under his guidance, violence became a last resort. Instead of shootings, there were sit-downs. Instead of retaliation, there were negotiations. Marty used diplomacy the way most outlaws used guns. He treated peace like currency, something to be brokered, traded, and invested in. He believed that every gun fired cost money, and every agreement made doubled it. At the height of their cooperation, Montreal's criminal network was operating like a corporate empire. Money flowed upward through construction firms, real estate projects, and import-export companies. Cocaine shipments arrived through the port of Montreal, moving seamlessly from Sicilian hands to Angel logistics networks. From there, it spread across Canada and the northeastern United States. Clean, coordinated, efficient. The Union's influence extended far beyond drugs. The Angels and the Mafia shared control of nightclubs, strip bars, and gambling operations. They split profits from protection rackets and loan sharking businesses, even in industries that appeared legitimate. Private security, waste management, trucking. There were hidden layers that led back to Marty's system. But what truly made the Union powerful wasn't money. It was trust. Both sides respected the chain of command. Both knew that betrayal would mean collapse. Marty's word carried weight in both camps, not because of fear, but because he never overplayed his hand. He knew when to compromise, when to pull back, and when to let others think they'd won. Even law enforcement admitted that something remarkable had happened. In their reports, they noted that Montreal's homicide rate had quietly dropped during the Union years. The kind of high-profile violence that once filled headlines simply stopped. The underworld had gone quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was organized. Behind that quiet stood two men, Leonardo Rizzuto, the son of the old guard, and Marty Robert, the architect of the new. Together, they had created a hybrid system, the tradition of the mafia fused with the innovation of the modern outlaw. But peace, even managed peace, has its enemies. Not everyone liked the idea of cooperation. Within both organizations, there were factions that saw the Union as betrayal. Younger bikers wanted action, not negotiation. Old-school mobsters distrusted the Angels, calling them loud men pretending to be gentlemen. Whispers of dissent started to spread. In the shadows, rival groups, including the Blood Family Mafia and splintered offshoots of the Rock Machine, began testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Marty anticipated it. He always did. He created a council, an informal tribunal of senior members from both sides, to mediate disputes before they could escalate. When tensions rose, he handled it personally. If a crew got too ambitious, he'd meet their leaders face to face, speaking in that calm, measured tone that made men rethink their next move. Most times that was enough. On the rare occasions it wasn't. Problems were resolved quietly, efficiently, and permanently. He understood that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the management of it. And for a few short years, he managed it perfectly. Montreal's criminal world entered what some detectives later called the calmest storm. Money was good, alliances were strong, and no one dared challenge the balance Marty had created. To the outside world, the Hells Angels were still the same outlaw brotherhood they had always been. Loud, intimidating, and loyal. But to those who knew how the system really worked, they had become something else entirely. The enforcement arm of a multinational criminal corporation. And their quiet CEO was the man who understood better than anyone that the pen, in his world, was far deadlier than the pistol. In a rare private moment, Marty once said to an associate, "Blood used to make brothers. Now it just stains the floor. I'd rather make peace and count the money." That was the essence of Marty Robert's rule. Not softer, just smarter. He wasn't taming the underworld. He was teaching it how to evolve. But as his power grew, so did the world's attention. And far beyond Canada's borders, new forces were watching him with interest. From Europe, from the Middle East, and even from Moscow. The man who once fought to control a single city was about to find himself at the center of a global web of power. The age of blood and diplomacy was ending. The age of politics and global alliances was about to begin. Enemies of the state. Marty Robert had spent years turning chaos into order, outlaws into operators, and a street-level empire into a global enterprise. But power, no matter how quietly it's earned, never stays invisible forever. By 2018, his name had begun surfacing in places it was never supposed to appear. Government dossiers, intelligence briefings, and classified countercrime reports that stretched far beyond Canada's borders. To the underworld, he was a businessman. To law enforcement, he was a ghost. But to world powers, Marty Robert was becoming something else entirely, a geopolitical problem. It started with whispers from Interpol. After a series of drug seizures in Eastern Europe, investigators noticed a pattern. The shipping containers all traced back to Canadian-owned logistics companies, many of which had quiet ties to Hells Angels intermediaries. What startled them wasn't the drugs. It was the documentation. Everything looked legitimate. Bills of lading, customs forms, even insurance policies were perfect. Too perfect. It was as if someone with corporate precision was managing the criminal pipeline from behind the scenes. When agents dug deeper, one name kept appearing in coded financial ledgers and encrypted emails. MR, always signed off with the number 81. Soon after, European intelligence began linking those shipments to the Night Wolves, a Russian nationalist motorcycle club with deep connections to the Kremlin. On paper, the Night Wolves were a patriotic riding group. In reality, they operated as informal enforcers for Moscow's foreign policy operations, moving money, information, and influence across borders under the cover of biker culture. Canadian and Scandinavian intelligence agencies began noticing overlapping routes between Marty's Canadian network and the Night Wolves' Eastern European branches. Flights, shipments, even charitable cultural exchanges that conveniently lined up with major narcotics transfers. The rumor spread fast. Marty Robert was doing business with Russia. Officially, there was no proof. Unofficially, investigators were convinced. The story went that Marty's lieutenants had brokered a deal through intermediaries in Serbia and Belarus, exchanging access to Western ports and laundering channels for cheap Russian crude sold off the books. It was the black market oil trade, worth billions, and it needed infrastructure that only someone like Marty could provide. He had the trucks, the ports, and the networks. They had the product and the protection. It was, in essence, global organized crime's version of a multinational merger. When the story reached Canadian intelligence, the tone changed. Marty was no longer just a crime figure. He was now being quietly referred to in CSIS memos as a non-state economic actor, the kind of phrase reserved for people who move money the way nations move armies. For Marty, this was uncharted territory. He hadn't set out to become an international player. He'd simply built efficiency into chaos, and the world had noticed. To his allies, he was still the man who kept the peace. To his enemies, he was proof that an outlaw could outthink entire institutions. Behind the scenes, he denied everything. When journalists pressed law enforcement officials for comment, they gave the usual answers: ongoing investigation, cannot confirm or deny. But one retired RCMP analyst said it plainly in an interview years later. Marty didn't need to meet Putin to be useful to him. All he had to do was keep the highways open. The truth was that Marty had become indispensable to too many powerful people. The union he'd forged between the Hells Angels and the Rizzuto organization had matured into an international broker system. He had friends in Italy, contacts in the Balkans, and connections with shipping magnates in the Middle East. Whenever someone needed to move something, product, money, or influence, Marty's routes were the safest. The more the world fractured politically, the more valuable neutrality became. He played his cards like a statesman. When European police forces raided local Angel chapters in Germany and the Netherlands, Marty quietly withdrew Canadian support, protecting his people from being caught in the dragnet. When the U.S. Treasury Department began blacklisting entities suspected of helping Russia evade sanctions, Marty's network adjusted instantly, diverting shipments through Cyprus and Turkey. Every move was cold, efficient, preemptive. He was playing chess on a global board that most people didn't even know existed. But power draws light, and light, in his world, was fatal. By 2020, the FBI and RCMP had reopened dormant cases on his operations, this time under the umbrella of counterintelligence. They weren't just looking for drugs or weapons. They were looking for patterns of influence. How many companies under his umbrella had received government contracts? How many politicians had unknowingly taken donations funneled through his fronts? How many border officials had been helped through biker-owned charities? The answers were never conclusive, but they were unsettling. For the first time in years, Marty felt the temperature rising. Raids increased. Surveillance teams began shadowing his lieutenants. Reporters started circling again, hungry for the story that would link Canada's quiet outlaw empire to the corridors of global power. Marty responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. He reorganized leadership again, decentralizing key operations. No single captain knew the entire network anymore. Every route, every business, every offshore account was firewalled from the next. It was a digital fortress, built not with violence, but with encryption. Even if law enforcement managed to seize one branch, the rest would survive. Privately, some within his circle began to worry. The man who had built his reputation on peace and subtlety was now facing enemies he couldn't meet face to face. Governments didn't negotiate, they erased. But Marty wasn't naive. He started cutting back on appearances, limiting communication to trusted messengers. To most, he had simply vanished. No sightings, no calls, no leaks. His associates began calling him the man in the static. The irony was that, while the world labeled him a threat, Marty never saw himself as one. He wasn't trying to destabilize governments or influence wars. He was just doing what he'd always done, building systems that worked. But when those systems touched everything from narcotics to energy markets, the line between outlaw and operator disappeared. In 2021, a joint intelligence report between Canada and the EU described him as a critical logistical asset to transnational organized crime convergence. In plain English, Marty Robert had become the infrastructure of global black markets. His routes were so deeply embedded in legitimate trade that shutting them down would have damaged national economies. That was his shield. That was his genius. The irony of it all was simple. The man who once fought to survive a street war in Montreal had now built an empire that outgrew borders. The Hells Angels, the Mafia, the cartels, all of them were still part of his world. But Marty was now operating in a league that no longer had a name. He was too big to touch and too valuable to remove. Still, in back rooms and boardrooms, his name was now said with caution. Politicians, bankers, even intelligence officers all understood the same thing. You couldn't fight someone who ran the roads your economy depended on. You could only monitor him and hope he never decided to take sides. And that was Marty Robert's greatest victory and his most dangerous legacy. White-collar outlaws. By the early 2020s, Marty Robert had mastered a paradox that few in organized crime ever could. He'd become untouchable, not by hiding in shadows, but by standing in plain sight. His empire no longer looked like an outlaw network. It looked like a portfolio. Behind shell corporations and silent partnerships, Marty had woven his criminal infrastructure into the fabric of Canada's economy. Every piece of concrete poured, every truck on a highway, every deal inked in a glass tower, somewhere, directly or indirectly, fed into his machine. He understood that violence brought heat, but contracts brought control. So he pivoted, not away from crime, but toward legitimacy. Under his direction, the Hells Angels and their affiliates began acquiring or quietly investing in companies that looked perfectly normal. Construction firms, freight transport, security services, waste management, and real estate holdings. These weren't fronts in the traditional sense. They were real, functioning businesses, licensed, audited, and often staffed by people who had no idea who ultimately signed their paychecks. It began with trucking. The Angels already controlled much of the logistics behind illegal distribution. Formalizing that infrastructure was easy. They registered fleets under new corporate identities, took legitimate shipping contracts, and began winning bids for municipal delivery routes. Every time a city awarded a public contract, Marty's companies made sure to be the lowest bidder. Through that single shift, he transformed an entire criminal network into a legitimate supply chain. From there, he moved into construction and real estate. Canada was experiencing a housing boom, and Marty saw opportunity where others saw bureaucracy. Through numbered corporations, he purchased controlling interests in mid-sized construction firms. His influence spread quietly through Quebec and Ontario's building industries. from high-rise projects to suburban developments. What made it work wasn't corruption, it was competence. His teams delivered on time, under budget, and without the inefficiency that plagued government contractors. Even city officials, suspicious as they were, admitted privately that those guys get it done. He didn't just buy companies, he bought trust. Each acquisition gave him legitimacy in new circles. He started attending economic conferences through proxies, using executives who spoke his language of numbers and efficiency, but wore the right suits. By 2022, financial journalists had begun describing a surge of aggressive but strangely organized investment activity across Montreal's industrial corridor. They didn't know it, but they were watching Marty's empire evolve in real time. Meanwhile, the union with the Rizzutos gave him a financial backbone. The mafia had always been experts at laundering through restaurants, casinos, and import companies. Marty expanded that into digital territory. His network created shell investment vehicles that pooled money from dozens of fronts into centralized holding firms. From there, profits were funneled into real estate investment trusts, offshore accounts in Malta, and private equity funds registered in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. On paper, it all looked like the rise of an aggressive Canadian investment conglomerate. Law enforcement tried to keep up, but traditional methods didn't work. You couldn't wiretap a board meeting. You couldn't infiltrate an office staffed with college-educated accountants. When the RCMP launched Operation Valance to investigate the Angels' financial networks, they found themselves chasing legal paperwork that led back to legitimate banks. The difference between Marty's operations and real corporate empires had become academic. What made Marty dangerous wasn't his violence, it was his vision. He realized that if crime was built like business, it could survive forever. Every chapter president became a regional director. Every territory became a market. The Angels weren't earning street money anymore. They were moving capital, and the cultural transformation that came with it was just as profound. Gone were the days of bikers flaunting wealth or riding openly with outlaw insignia. Marty enforced a new code: blend in. He told members to wear clean clothes, register vehicles, pay taxes, and appear normal. "We don't rebel," he once told an inner circle of officers. "We outperform." In some ways, he'd achieved what governments had failed to. He'd created order. His businesses expanded beyond Canada's borders. In Ireland, Dubai, and Spain, subsidiaries linked to his network began investing in logistics and energy projects. These weren't backroom deals. They were polished, corporate negotiations signed in boardrooms, often attended by people who never knew they were dealing with organized crime. For those who did know, it didn't matter. Marty paid well, and his contracts always delivered. There were moments when journalists tried to pull the thread. In 2023, a Quebec financial reporter released a piece suggesting that certain private construction tenders were linked to shell firms with Hells Angels ties. The article vanished within 48 hours, the author citing editorial review. That was the other side of Marty's reach: quiet, efficient, and absolute. By now, Marty wasn't just leading the Angels. He was redefining them. Younger members called him the CEO, while older ones still referred to him as the Capo. But inside the network, everyone understood that the days of loud rebellion were gone. The new era of organized crime didn't need to fight for dominance. It simply needed to own the systems everyone else relied on. It wasn't about guns anymore. It was about paperwork, property, and the kind of influence that couldn't be photographed. One former associate described it best in a private conversation later leaked during an investigation. Marty's not running a gang anymore. He's running a shadow version of Canada. Same infrastructure, different morals. By the time law enforcement realized how deeply embedded his empire had become, it was already too late. Every time they tried to pull him down, they risked collapsing legitimate sectors tied to his network. His companies employed hundreds, paid taxes, and even received government subsidies. To dismantle Marty Robert's empire, they would have had to dismantle a part of the Canadian economy itself, and that, in the end, was his genius. The global expansion. By 2023, Marty Robert had outgrown the limits of geography. Canada was stable, the money was flowing, and the streets were quiet. For most men, that would have been enough, but Marty was never driven by comfort. He was driven by control, and control in his mind wasn't about dominance over a single city or country. It was about scalability, the ability to replicate the same system anywhere in the world and have it function perfectly. He wasn't just running a criminal network anymore. He was building a multinational organism. The next phase of his empire unfolded quietly, like most of his moves did. On the surface, it looked like normal business expansion, new partnerships, new investors, new trade routes. But behind those polished deals and glossy paperwork was the same DNA that had built the Hells Angels empire in Canada: precision, loyalty, and a near-religious devotion to structure. Europe, the second home. Europe had always fascinated Marty. Its outlaw culture had been both a model and a warning. The biker wars in Denmark and Finland had shown him what happened when discipline failed, while the German and Dutch chapters had proven that a well-run network could outlast governments. When he began expanding across the Atlantic, he did it not with violence, but with invitations. He dispatched trusted Canadian lieutenants to Sweden, Norway, and Germany, sending them as consultants, not soldiers. Their mission was simple: help struggling chapters adopt the Canadian model. That meant central accounting, strict codes of conduct, and profit sharing instead of chaos. Within 2 years, the difference was visible. Violence dropped. Recruitment grew. Local police, once dealing with unpredictable outlaws, now found themselves facing businessmen on motorcycles, polite, registered, and legally insulated. Behind the scenes, Marty built a transatlantic logistics system that mirrored global shipping routes. Canadian companies under his umbrella began forming partnerships with European freight handlers. Legal goods moved in one direction, illicit product in another, and both streams flowed through the same infrastructure. By 2024, investigators across Scandinavia and Central Europe began noting that the Hells Angels' logistics patterns now resembled those of multinational freight corporations: synchronized schedules, centralized records, standardized contracts. What they didn't know was that Marty himself had helped design those systems from his private office in Quebec. The Middle East, the new frontier. Europe was organization. The Middle East was opportunity. In Dubai, Marty saw what few others could: a hub where money could move freely and questions were optional. He began forming ties with business figures from the UAE, Lebanon, and Turkey, not through criminal intermediaries, but through brokers who specialized in offshore investments. He used these connections to quietly funnel profits from his Canadian construction empire into real estate developments across the Gulf. Soon, Marty's network had its hands in ports, oil logistics, and even private aviation. Some of his subsidiaries in Dubai and Cyprus began chartering flights that, according to aviation records, transported commercial cargo. In truth, those flights often carried a mix of legitimate shipments and illicit assets, high-value art, cash, and occasionally narcotics disguised under diplomatic freight. Every transaction was buried under layers of legal complexity. The contracts were real, the businesses were legitimate, but buried deep in their balance sheets were movements of money that no audit could ever fully trace. By this point, the Angels' European and Middle Eastern networks were operating as semi-independent franchises, self-funded, self-sustaining, but all loyal to one source: Canada. Every major decision still required approval from Marty's council, and every major profit still sent a percentage back to Montreal. He had turned the outlaw world into something resembling a federation. Global standardization. The brilliance of Marty's empire wasn't just in how wide it spread, it was in how consistently it functioned. He established training manuals and operational blueprints, the kind of documentation you'd expect from a legitimate corporation. Each new chapter adopted the same financial rules, reporting formats, and communication systems. Even terminology was standardized. Every meeting, every contract, every coded message followed the same structure. One investigator from Europol later remarked, "It was like investigating a company that had a criminal side, not a criminal group pretending to be a company." By this point, Marty's control was so refined that he could predict the outcome of a regional conflict before it happened. When the Outlaws Motorcycle Club attempted to challenge Angel dominance in Ireland, Marty didn't send men to fight. He froze their suppliers. Within weeks, the Outlaws' income streams dried up, and their operations collapsed. Not a single bullet fired, just economic strangulation. He didn't need to rule through fear. He ruled through efficiency. The global boardroom. By the end of 2024, Marty's influence reached into over a dozen countries, from Canada to Norway, from Dubai to Spain, from Serbia to Ireland. Each region had its own leadership, but they all reported to what insiders referred to as the board. The board wasn't a physical table or office. It was a virtual network of encrypted communication between chapter presidents, financial controllers, and Marty himself. Through it, global operations were synchronized in real time. Profits were distributed, decisions were voted on, and disputes were arbitrated without anyone ever meeting face to face. It was organized crime, digitized. Law enforcement agencies around the world began sharing intelligence under a new code name, Operation Atlas. Their goal was to map the financial and communication networks that tied the Hells Angels to Marty's holding companies. But even with international cooperation, they couldn't keep up. The more they followed the money, the more it split, like tracing veins in a body that never ended. Meanwhile, Marty stayed invisible. He rarely traveled, never appeared in photographs, and hadn't used a traceable phone in years. His orders were passed verbally through trusted envoys who used rotating code phrases and burner devices. To the public, he was just a rumor, a name whispered in the same breath as global power brokers and cartel financiers, the unintended consequence. Ironically, Marty's success began to threaten the very balance he had built. His empire was so large, so cleanly embedded in legitimate economies, that removing it risked financial consequences for the countries involved. European banks unknowingly held his money. Municipal governments depended on his companies for infrastructure. Global corporations partnered with his logistics subsidiaries. He'd become what intelligence agencies called a systemic actor, someone whose removal could destabilize the very systems that opposed him. It was no longer a matter of crime. It was a matter of equilibrium. For Marty, this was the final validation. He had taken a biker club founded in the back streets of California and turned it into an economic network spanning 3 continents. Every mile of road, every shipment, every dollar was part of the same design. And yet the higher his empire climbed, the thinner the air became. Inside the organization, murmurs of tension began surfacing. Regional bosses growing restless, younger recruits hungry for the outlaw identity their fathers had told them about. The rebellion that Marty had buried was beginning to stir again. But for now, his empire stood unchallenged, a global machine, built in silence. And at its center sat a man who had proven that power didn't need to roar, it just needed to run on time. The war that never ends. For nearly 2 decades, Marty Robert had accomplished what no outlaw before him could. He made the streets quiet. The wars that once tore through Quebec, Ontario, and Montreal were over. Rivalries were managed, not fought. Money flowed, not blood. But in the underworld, peace is never permanent. It only lasts as long as everyone believes it's profitable. And by 2025, belief was starting to fade. The cracks began in small, unremarkable ways. Missed payments, late shipments, quiet arguments in dark bars between younger members and older officers. To most people, it looked like ordinary tension. To Marty, it was the sound of a storm building behind the walls. The first sign came from within the Union, the alliance between the Hells Angels and the Rizzuto family that had kept Montreal's criminal ecosystem balanced for nearly a decade. When Leonardo Rizzuto was arrested and later released under intense surveillance, a vacuum formed inside his organization. The old Sicilian guards didn't trust the new leadership. The younger generation didn't respect the old traditions. And the bikers, Marty's men, found themselves caught in the middle of mob politics that no longer followed the old rules. Then came the rise of the Blood Family Mafia. They weren't a large organization, not compared to the Angels or the Rizzutos, But they were aggressive, unpredictable, and unafraid. Born out of disillusioned ex-members from both sides, they saw themselves as the next evolution, a hybrid of biker boldness and mafia ruthlessness. Their operation started small, a few stolen shipments, a handful of extorted bars, but they grew fast. By the time anyone realized it, they had control of local street crews, arms routes, and portions of the cocaine trade that once belonged to the Union. For Marty, it was déjà vu, the beginning of another cycle. But he wasn't the same man who had fought through the Quebec Biker War decades earlier. He wasn't interested in going back to bloodshed. Instead, he tried to contain the threat through diplomacy, the same way he'd handled every challenge before. He sent envoys, called meetings, and offered the Blood family's leaders a place at the table, not as equals, but as partners. They refused. The Blood family wasn't built on structure. It was built on defiance. Their leadership didn't want a share of Marty's empire. They wanted to take it. They called him the old man in the shadows, a relic of a different era. To them, Marty represented the establishment they'd grown up fighting. And so, the cycle began again. The first major hit came in early 2024, a convoy ambushed on a remote stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway. 3 of Marty's senior logistics officers were killed and $500,000 in product vanished. The attackers left no insignia, no message. But everyone knew who it was. The Blood family had declared war. Marty's immediate response wasn't violence. It was control. He called a meeting of regional heads in a nondescript warehouse outside Montreal. No colors, no press, no phones. His message was calm but absolute. If we start another war, we lose everything we built. We don't fight for territory. We fight for stability. The men nodded, but the truth was harder to contain. On the streets, younger angels were restless. They hadn't grown up in Marty's world of boardrooms and balance sheets. They wanted the old world, the roar of engines, the thrill of dominance, the identity of rebellion. To them, peace felt like stagnation, and to prove themselves, they started breaking the rules. By summer, retaliatory hits were happening weekly. Drive-bys in Laval, bombings in Hamilton, beatings in Ottawa. The same headlines Marty had buried years ago were back on the front pages. He knew it was spiraling, but he also knew something else. The Blood family wasn't the real threat. They were a symptom. The real danger was inside his own system. For years, his empire had thrived on structure, discipline, and loyalty. But as it grew into a global machine, that same structure became fragile. Different regions operated independently now, and not all of them followed his rules. Some chapter presidents began making their own deals with cartels. Others pocketed profits that were meant for the central fund. There were whispers that a few even started negotiating with law enforcement in secret. The empire that once felt bulletproof was beginning to fracture from within. Reports started reaching him from Ontario, men missing, shipments rerouted, internal audits that didn't add up. He summoned his council again. The meeting was tense. For the first time, voices were raised. Some wanted war, others demanded a crackdown. Marty just sat in silence, the same calm presence he'd been since the beginning. When the room quieted, he simply said, "We survive by staying invisible. The minute we start shouting, the world starts watching again." But the world was already watching. After years of relative quiet, Canadian intelligence and Interpol had resumed active monitoring of Marty's network. The combination of renewed violence and suspicious financial flows made it impossible to ignore. International task forces began coordinating raids in Belgium, Spain, and Canada simultaneously. Operation Atlas had reawakened. Each raid hit a different arm of Marty's empire, but none reached him. He remained one step ahead, shutting down routes and dissolving companies before authorities could touch them. He wasn't untouchable anymore, but he was still unpredictable. Still, for the first time in years, he looked vulnerable. His closest allies were either arrested, retired, or dead. His empire was fighting itself, and the Blood family wasn't backing down. They were multiplying. They didn't need territory anymore. They just needed chaos. Every explosion, every body, every headline chipped away at the illusion of order he'd built. In the quiet of his home office in Quebec, Marty studied the reports laid out on his desk. Maps, financial summaries, photos of men he'd known for years. some loyal, some lost. He realized what every empire builder eventually does, that control is temporary, and power always erodes from within before it's taken from outside. But if Marty Robert's story had proven anything, it was that he never surrendered to the storm. He adapted to it. So once again, he started restructuring. He dissolved several high-risk chapters, cut off rogue elements, and focused his remaining power base around Quebec and Ontario. The rest of the world could burn if it had to. He'd rather rule a smaller empire he could trust than a global one that could betray him. In private, he told a confidant, "I've spent half my life keeping men from killing each other. Maybe that's all leadership really is, holding the line until someone else forgets why it mattered." He was tired, but not finished. The world saw a man in decline. The streets saw something else, the calm before whatever came next. Because every time people thought the war was over, Marty proved that it never really ended. It just changed shape. And somewhere between peace and chaos, between legend and ghost, he was still there, rebuilding in silence. The legacy of power. By the time the headlines faded and the investigators moved on, Marty Robert had already outlived the story people were trying to write about him. The world would remember him as a biker, a crime boss, maybe even a ghost. But the people who actually knew him, the ones who'd worked beside him, feared him, or tried to catch him, understood something much deeper. He wasn't just a product of the outlaw world. He was its evolution. His empire wasn't a fleeting reign of fear or rebellion. It was a blueprint, a living system that outlasted its creator. Even as raids dismantled portions of the 81 nation, its rhythm continued. Shipments still moved. Meetings still happened. Money still flowed. The network he'd built was too decentralized, too integrated into the fabric of legitimate commerce to ever truly die. Like veins beneath asphalt, it just kept pulsing, unseen but essential. Inside Canada, his legacy was everywhere. You could see it in the way modern biker clubs operated, quieter, more organized, more patient. The days of open warfare and loud defiance were over. The new generation had learned that the smartest kind of power doesn't announce itself. It builds foundations, not chaos. They didn't wear their colors in public anymore. They wore suits, signed contracts, and shook hands with city officials. That was Marty's philosophy, distilled and passed down like scripture. If you can control the system, you never need to fight it. Even law enforcement agencies begrudgingly admitted his impact. One RCMP analyst summarized it perfectly during a closed briefing. "We didn't beat Marty Robert. We adapted because of him. The structures created to investigate him, joint intelligence task forces, financial tracking divisions, encrypted data analysis, became permanent fixtures of Canada's national security. In trying to catch him, the system had to evolve too. He had forced entire institutions to modernize, to think smarter, faster, more globally. His influence had reshaped both sides of the law. For the men who once rode under him, Marty became a myth, the quiet leader who turned rebellion into enterprise. To them, he wasn't a criminal. He was proof that loyalty and logic could coexist in a world that usually chose one or the other. They still invoked his rules at meetings, even years after he disappeared from the public eye. Marty's Code, they called it. No unnecessary noise, no reckless violence, no disloyalty tolerated. In biker terms, that was peace through control. But not everyone saw him as a visionary. To his enemies, both in the government and the underworld, he was a manipulator who disguised greed as discipline. They accused him of turning outlaw brotherhood into bureaucracy, stripping away the last bit of soul that once made the biker culture unique. To them, Marty wasn't a builder. He was a manager, a man who replaced passion with procedure. And yet, even his critics couldn't deny his results. When historians and journalists pieced together the story of Canada's modern organized crime network, Marty's fingerprints were everywhere, from logistics firms that once served as smuggling fronts to construction conglomerates whose owners traced back to his original contacts. Every sector, from transport to waste management to real estate, had a ghost of his influence buried somewhere in the paperwork. He had managed to do what governments and corporations spend decades trying to achieve: total operational harmony. But Marty himself had long since vanished from public view. Some said he fled overseas, living quietly under a new identity in Europe or South America. Others believed he'd retired in plain sight, blending into suburban life under a different name. There were rumors, a sighting in Cyprus, a property in northern Italy, a photograph in Dubai, none confirmed, all believable. The truth was simple. When you build a machine big enough to run itself, you don't need to be seen. Even the people closest to him weren't sure what became of him. Some said he still called once a year just to check on the flow. Never about money, only about order. Others said he'd cut contact completely, leaving behind a note that read, "If I'm not there, the system should still work." And it did. The Hells Angels in Canada, his Hells Angels, remained the most disciplined branch in the world. They operated like a shadow government, with their own economy, rules, and diplomacy. Other nations modeled themselves after them, often without realizing it. Australia, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe all borrowed pages from the Canadian model. In 2025, an Interpol report referred to it as the Robert Doctrine. It wasn't meant as praise, but it might as well have been. His doctrine was simple: decentralize control, legitimize income, avoid unnecessary wars, make peace profitable. It was the same formula he'd lived by for over 40 years. There's a story, maybe true, maybe myth, that sometime after his disappearance, an encrypted message circulated through private biker networks across Europe and North America. It was short, unsigned, but unmistakable in tone. Keep it clean, keep it quiet, keep it moving. That phrase became an unspoken motto among leaders who came after him. It was Marty's final lesson, that survival in the modern world wasn't about power or fear, but efficiency. To the rest of the world, he'll always be remembered as a criminal mastermind who redefined the underworld. But to those who really paid attention, Marty Robert was something else entirely: a mirror, a reflection of what happens when intelligence meets ambition in a world too rigid to contain it. He didn't create chaos, he managed it. He didn't seek fame, he built systems. And in doing so, he became the quiet architect of a new kind of power, one that doesn't shout, doesn't bleed, and doesn't die. Even now, years later, his legend lingers not in stories, but in the silence he left behind. Because Marty Robert didn't vanish, he just stepped back, and the world he built kept running, exactly the way he designed it to. If you want more stories like this, about the men who built power from the shadows and shaped worlds most people never see, make sure you follow, like, and subscribe. Every week we uncover the hidden architects behind the chaos, the ones who didn't chase the spotlight, but made it move. This was Marty Robert, the quiet architect. We'll see you in the next one.